thanks for coming out, those who are live. It's wonderful to see so many because it's cold, it's icy, it's winter in Michigan. You know, and a treat for you all is that you go back at any time and pick up coffee or pick up a dessert just outside the doors there. We want to introduce people important in this room for the audience to know and meet and greet, and some who are online and some who are not either, but have been part of the team putting this together. And I always like to do this every time we meet. We had 6 team members to put together this series. We each came up with topics that we thought were important post-pandemic. It's what drew us together. There was so much rubble from the pandemic, from George Floyd's murder, from all the other things that came up, housing, healthcare, etc., that we felt, what are we going to do? How are we going to put things back together? We really need to have spent some time not really thinking about what the new norms are going to be, but just looking at what happened, what's the mess that we have before us, and how do we move forward from that. Each person, after a time, selected 3 different topics out of there were something like nearly 40 topics that we had come up with, and then each person selected out of their top 3, 1. So that's where we got the 6 topics. And so team members are Kathy Organ here in front of me, and Kathy did the community section. There's Kathy Calabretta on Zoom, which is she selected the education. So the topics of the series, the issues are ones that she has selected. Thomas Trahey in the back doing all of the sound. It has done race, and that's our February session, race and racism. And Mike McKinney, who is a faculty member at West Shore, selected science. He grew ill with one infection after another. He's better now. It took him 4 months at least. But he generated that section. Matt Sanderson, also a faculty member at West Shore, is Truth in Politics. He's a philosopher. And then my section is economics, and it's at the end of, in April. So that's the slate. We have also in our audience tonight Eric Smith, who's the director of the Public Library. Together with my organization, the Bondia Center, we are managing this series. We are grateful to all of you sitting in this audience, as well as we who are working, because we're all taxpayers. And the project has been generously supported by the Michigan Council for the Arts and Cultural Affairs, as well as for Michigan Humanities, which is also funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. So we just need to do projects and send in requests, and it's been really wonderful to work with them. So welcome to all of you. This is shifting landscapes. Things keep shifting, don't they, all the time? We think we're on the road to recovery, and then all of a sudden it's another step back or 10 steps back. But that's the way it goes. Last week with the education series, we have three nights for each of our topics. What that is to say are 2 different things, well, 2 things, they're both related. One is there isn't, a topic as large as education can't be done in one night. It really can't be done in 3, and we've got 3 different issues, but at least it says, you know what, there's a whole lot more. And if you're not really interested in this particular in education, but something else, go for it. All we wanted to do is to start. So that's what these 3 topics in education are, as they were in community, science, and as we go on. It's just a beginning spot. So we came together, and each person, as I say, sort of brought forward then the issues that were going to be discussed. And Kathy Calabretta brought to the table the 1619 project. That was our project last week. And she brought forward CRT. And then we weren't quite sure what the third one was going to be. There were lots of different options. As I said to the audience last week, that many of you are new and didn't hear that conversation, the 1619 project was something that we had heard about. It had been in the New York Times. It was a new history of the very beginning, a new way, a new interpretation. Facts were fundamentally the same. When did the first slave ship arrive, bringing blacks from Africa to the shores of the new emerging, not yet, bound colonies, but emerging. And so we looked at that with a historian last week whose period is not the early colonial and early republic of the nation, but his is the Civil War and Reconstruction. That was deliberately done. It's different from tonight. We wanted somebody there who was out of the fray and who could take a look at that history and take a look at the historians in the United States and elsewhere who both praised it and who had gripes and complaints and critiques about it. And that was then to help all of us go back and read it. We didn't assume anyone last week was going to have read it, but just it was an impetus to help everybody get some tools to read it. And Robert Cook at that point in time joked with us and said it was one of the few sort of projects where the far right and the far left actually coalesced and both griped at it rather than supported it. So he said, boy, strange bedfellows, and that's what happens. So tonight, our topic is different and our approach is different. It is CRT. When Kathy presented CRT, she said, I don't quite know what this is. And we all looked at each other and we said, we've heard it, don't know what it is. And we reflected and thought that, if it's been on the news, what CRT actually was from somebody who practiced it was given maybe a 3-second time to describe it, or a 30-second time, maybe at most 3 minutes. When we dived deeper, dove deeper? Ooh, where's the grammarian? Maybe both are okay. When we dove deeper into the reading, what we found was, because it had always come up with teaching children, K-12, and especially very young ones too, that CRT was actually a law school curriculum. It really wasn't taught to children at all. And Robert made the joke last week knowing we were going to do CRT this week, and he said, I tell parents that if their kid comes home and says, I studied CRT today, that child is a genius. So, we're going to find out today. So we had to change what we were going to be looking at, because in order to know something about CRT, we all needed information about what it is. And so what the speaker we have tonight is a lawyer herself. She has also studied CRT. She now researches within CRT framework for many of her projects, as well as teaches CRT. So that's the framework we're going to have, is to have somebody who loves it, who works with it, who deals with it, who believes in it, to talk to us about it. And then another time, we can really take a look at a critique, but each of us then will have some information. The reason why this approach is different from the 1619 is because the 1619 book is out there for all of us to read. It's intended to be for the public. CRT is not. It's intended to be for the professional. So that's why we took a kind of a point of having a professional talk to us in the public about it, as opposed to diving in really deeply right now and having a discussion about pros and cons about it. So hope it all works for everyone. So now what I want to do is to really introduce, I think I don't need anything else. Next week. Yeah, because it's important. Because that third session, it was like, what do we do now? Well, what we haven't done when we took this approach with CRT was talk about the kids. Talk about those board meetings that we see where we had board members and parents and members from the community arguing about what was going on in the classroom. And I sat there and thought, why don't we ask the teachers? So that's who will be with us next week. Our two teachers from Ludington area schools, one a middle school teacher and a high school teacher. Both are historians. Both of them teach history. In fact, they've worked the quiz bowl with all the kids over the years. So we'll be asking them, hearing from them, how do they teach children and youth difficult truths. What do they do, and how do they change? How do they move and flow with the changes in what people come up with for history? It changes and evolves. So we're going to be listening to and asking questions of people who are in the classroom, who have had training for teaching children about things, and what is it that their choices are. So we hope that you either listen on Zoom or come back live and participate in that. So that's the way the three topics in education go. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Jamila, sorry. Jamila, I mispronounced her name. I didn't mean to. Jamila Jefferson-Jones. She graduated from Harvard College, and she graduated from Harvard Law School. She practiced law in D.C. and New Orleans for more than 10 years before she entered education to teach. She is now a member of Wayne Law at Wayne State University here in Michigan. She's also gone back and forth a little bit to Kansas. She has a high schooler in his senior year and didn't want to move him, so she's commuting while he's finishing up. A good mom, huh? She has several articles, and we have a couple of them at the back. One is Living While Blackness is Nuisance. Another one, which is a very interesting one, which is the one, I don't know why I picked it up, I wanted that one instead, is The Exchange of Inmate Organs for Liberty, Diminishing the Yuck Factor in Bioethics Repugnance Debate. So, what that one was about, it's a long title, but that's what academics do, we like long titles. But it was that if there were twins in jail, in prison, and if one twin gave the other twin her kidney in a transplant, they'd both be freed. And so Jamila looked into that. And then another one on property law. That's another area of interest. So she looked at short-term rental agreements, can they increase home values? And it was about Airbnbs and other home sharing arrangements. So it's kind of breadth of interest. So please help me welcome Jamila Jefferson-Jones to talk with us tonight about CRT. Welcome, Jamila.
Thank you. Good evening, first of all, and thank you all for having me. Thank you for coming to hear me speak this evening, and thank you to Brooke for reaching out to me. I'm really appreciative of the state of Michigan and the grant that they have given for this series, and also to Mason County Public Libraries for having the forethought to have you all come out for this series and to put this on, and for all their hard work in doing so. As Brooke mentioned, I am on the law school faculty at Wayne State. I teach property. I teach a fair housing seminar this semester. And I use CRT to discuss a lot of those topics, in addition to, of course, teaching some of what's considered the bread and butter of property law. But I believe that that these issues cannot be taught without looking at our history and without using various theoretical lenses to do so. So CRT is not all that I use in the classroom, but it is something that I use. As was also mentioned, this is very much something that was born in the legal academy, but we'll get into all of that in just one moment. Before I get started, I'd be remiss, I gave some thank yous to you all, but I want to thank a couple of other people who are also in the audience, partly because I want you all to be nice to me. My mother's here, so my mom has joined us, and then I think at least one of my sisters. And then I also have some other folk who are here, a former colleague of mine, Christy, one of my former students who's become a good friend, Michael, who often comes. So I thank them also for coming out, even though coming out means joining us online. So let's get started. Let me pull up my PowerPoint. All right, so one big question, the big question is, what is CRT? So there are a couple of things that critical race theory is concerned with. And I recommended a couple of books to you all. One of them is Richard Delgado and Jean Stefansik's Critical Race Theory and Introduction. It's now in its third edition, and it's really helpful in that it's accessible, it's short, but not too short. So comprehensive, accessible. It has some kind of study questions that will help you all, if you choose to read it, to really kind of get, start thinking about CRT and how it functions. So CRT is concerned with studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. That's one of the things it does. It also considers the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourses consider, but it places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, context, group and self-interest, and also feelings and the unconscious. And then another thing about it is that CRT embraces the changing of foundations and structures. So whereas traditional civil rights embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions foundations and structures, and it also has an activist component to it, that beyond just questioning those structures and foundations, it looks to make changes to those structures and foundations as the remedy to what the research finds. So CRT is not new. We've been hearing about it in the news for the last 2 years but it's not new. It originated in the 1970s, and again, it originated among lawyers and activists and legal scholars, those who were working in that area. And some of those folk, and I put their pictures up, I'll explain why in a minute, but Derek Bell is widely considered the father or godfather of critical race theory. He's the late Derek Bell. He was a professor at Harvard and at NYU. And in fact, he was the first tenured Black professor at Harvard. Richard Delgado, Jean Stefansik, who the two of them wrote the book that I've recommended to you all. Neil Batanda, Kimberly Crenshaw, Mari Matsuda. And I show you these pictures because one of the things that is happening in the news, that seems to be the general perception, is that CRT is just about black and white. CRT is a I put my two words together, a multicultural enterprise. It is not just about black and white, it is about structures and power. And so you see here that the people involved are black and white and female and Asian and Latino. This is not just a black and white enterprise or a black versus white enterprise or something like that. So these are some and not all of the founding scholars in CRT. And what they found, and this is very well summed up recently in an interview with Professor Crenshaw, Kimberly Crenshaw, is that the so-called American racial dilemma was not simply a matter of prejudice, but a matter of structural disadvantages that stretched across American society. So I've mentioned that that CRT came out of the work of lawyers and legal scholars and legal activists. It has spread. You aren't wrong or it's not wrong when you've heard that it's spread, but the question is, where has it spread to? So it is still very much a theoretical lens that is used in higher education, not really on the undergraduate level. Like I said, started in law schools. But you'll find that in some advanced courses, and by that I mean master's level and higher in education, it is used. But it's not used to teach K-12 children. Instead, it's been used to explain structures, right? to look at, well, who gets put into discipline, right? Who gets tracked into higher level courses? Are there racial disparities there? How can we explain what's happening? And CRT is very much about explaining what's happening, but again, it has that extra dimension of then acting to tear down biased structures that may be causing things to happen. One of the exercises that's in the Delgado and Stefancic book that is really, really helpful in thinking about why CRT exists and what CRT scholars may ask they tell this kind of, we'll call it a fable, right, of aliens coming down to Earth, and the first human they come across is a homeless person who's sleeping on a park bench. And so the aliens say, we have advanced technology, we have a pill that we can give you. You can only have one pill. So we have 3 different pills, and I want to focus on 2 of those pills. We have a pill that'll get rid of all classism. No one will look down on the poor anymore. We have another pill that will get rid of all racism. No one will look down on others based upon their race or ethnicity. And so in the book, the homeless person chooses the pill that will get rid of classism. Now, this pill is going to be put into the water system. No one ever knows about it. It's just they wake up the next day and no one looks down on people because of their lack of resources. The problem is, although people are walking by and smiling at this man, they're shaking his hand, they're saying hello, his material circumstances do not change. So there's no more animosity toward him, but nothing has changed for him materially. By analogy, the same could happen with regard to racism. We can have a colorblind society, so-called colorblind society, where there is no racial animosity overnight. Let's say we could have that overnight. The problem is the structures are still in place that would leave people who had been a part of that previous hierarchy in substandard housing, having worse outcomes in health, worse educational outcomes. And so part of what CRT theorists looked at, part of their dilemma was, well, we've gotten past the 60s and all of the advances that came, the racial advancement that came in the 60s. But here they are sitting in the 70s wondering why there wasn't the sort of social advancement that they thought would be there. And so this was the response, this was their search for a response to try to pull back the covers and figure out what else was going on. And what they came up with was that there were structural disadvantages that were embedded in not just in American law and society that kept replicating the injustices that were in the past. So no longer necessarily the force of law in the such as Jim Crow and the like, right? That had been abolished, but there were still those vestiges that were really structural within the system and that would cause the system to keep replicating. So Derek Bell, the person who, the professor who was really, who's widely thought of as the father of CRT, coined this idea of interest convergence, which helped to explain this persistence, what he called the persistence of racism. And I want to get into that. I want to give you three tenets
of CRT. But before I get to them, you remember I just showed you these pictures. We have all these different types of people. And one of the things that drew all these different types of scholars to this work was that majority society racializes different minorities in different ways at different points in history. So they're aware of this historical truth. What do we mean by that? At one point in time, you might have a group that is thought of as being docile and in need of guidance, and therefore should be subjugated by the majority. Later, when those people are no longer subjugated in the same way, that same group could be racialized as being a threat. So we can see those sorts of things. That's this idea that racialization happens in different ways, and in different ways to different groups. So it was important to have people from various backgrounds who were working together to figure out this idea of, well, why haven't we had the racial advances that we thought would come out of the 60s? And so all of these folks were coming to this same idea at the same time, and they eventually got together and started workshopping their ideas. Another important idea, and this is under the heading of intersectionality, is that no one has a unitary identity. No one is just one thing, right? One can be white and LGBTQ, Black and Latino, Christian and a parent, right? You can be all of these things at once. So our identity is multifaceted, and that speaks to what sorts of remedies are necessary within the law to make sure that we're able to reach our fullest flourishing. Okay. All righty, those basic tenets that we are going to get into. One of the basic tenets of CRT is that racism is ordinary, that it's not aberrational. There are those who have had problems trying to accept that, and we see that, probably you saw some of that in your discussion of 1619 and the backlash to it. But that is a tenet of CRT, that racism is ordinary, it's not aberrational. That does not mean that everyone is racist. Instead, it means that there are systems that are in place that continue subjugation. And for that reason, it's difficult to eradicate racism with color blindness. Instead, you actually have to look at color, at class, at gender in order to understand what's actually going on. The other is interest convergence. And Brooke actually started talking to you a little bit about this. It's in one of the, I think the article that she read. I didn't expect her to mention that article. It's one of my older ones, but I'll tell you what interest convergence is and how I've used it. Interest convergence, it was coined by Professor Derek Bell. And what it says is that advancements in racial justice only occur when they also advance the interests of the majority. So what does that mean? So Derek Bell posited in one of his earlier articles that Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark case that caused, on the federal level, that caused the desegregation of public schools, that Brown v. Board of Education was that the civil rights attorneys were not able to win that case because there was a sudden awakening that made the court and society realize that Black children were being harmed by segregated schools. That's the story that we're often told. He instead said this was because the interests of the majority at this point had converged with the interest of the minority. So the interest of minority parents, of African-American parents and communities was to have their children in schools that were not Jim Crow schools, not separate, but equal. And we know that they were separate and unequal. So that was the interest. That was what was in the interest of Black Americans. What was in the interest of the United States government, so as representative of the larger majority, was something that complemented that. We are talking about 1954. There was no, this was not the first time that Black people had asked for this sort of relief, but all of a sudden it was given. So what was going on? We had just finished the Korean War. We had World War II, not so far behind us, not so far in the rear view mirror. And what was going on at this point was the beginnings of the Cold War. One of the things that the United States government was interested in was promoting democracy throughout the world, getting countries to choose democracy over communism. A number of those countries that were becoming, that were decolonizing and becoming independent were countries in Africa and Asia, countries with majority Black and Brown and Asian citizens, also in South America. And it was untenable. We could not go to them and preach that the United States had the better system of government if those people were also saying, but people like me aren't treated fairly in your country. So we have Derek Bell saying that in 1954, the interests of Black Americans lined up with foreign policy in the United States, and therefore that's why there was a win at that time. And you can imagine that there was outrage. There was outrage at his presumption that this is what was happening. People believed and wanted to believe, nope, this was about an awakening. This was about the morally right thing to do. And some years later, when certain documents were declassified, it was found that he was right, that there were a number of memos, government memos, Department of Defense memos, and others that said, we have to do something about our domestic racial unrest because it is hurting our foreign policy. So in my own work, in the piece that Brooke mentioned, I wrote about the Scott sisters of Mississippi. And with them, I used the idea of interest convergence to talk about the fact that although these women had been in prison for some time, all of a sudden, there was this interest in releasing them. And part of that was that Governor Haley Barbour was in a position where he needed a certain sort of political advancement, and they were the right vehicle at the right time. And then the way that he structured it was one in which one of the sisters had to give her kidney to the other sister. One sister was ailing, needed a kidney. And so, but it was this idea that they had been there for some time. The sister who was sick had been sick for some time, but this was a time in which it was helpful to the powers that be to give some relief. So that was the way that I talked about interest convergence there. In more recent work, which is the one I thought that she was going to mention, but I think you have it in the back to read. And she mentioned it actually in the introduction, #LivingWhile Blackness as Nuisance. In one of the historical sections, I talk about the civil rights movement and these aquatic dive-ins. Sit-ins were better remembered, but there were also dive-ins. And so in 1964, at a motel pool in St. Augustine, Florida, there was one of these dive-ins where the police are jumping into the pool trying to keep Black and white teenagers from being in the pool together. And these teenagers were having this protest. They were doing this on purpose, getting into the hotel pool together when it was supposed to be segregated. And these pictures are splashed all over the press. You have the motel manager pouring acid into the water. You have the police jumping in, trying to throw these kids out. And the images were very shocking. And at this time, we see another instance of interest convergence. President Lyndon Johnson had been talking to congressional leaders trying to get some legislation, civil rights legislation passed. And on a recorded line, he warned the lawmakers, and this is a quote, "Our whole foreign policy and everything else could go to hell over this." So again, there's this issue of the foreign policy. So at his urging, on the same day of his telephone call, the United States Senate passed a compromise bill prohibiting discrimination in the workplace, at public facilities like that pool, at polling places, and elsewhere. And the bill was signed into law by Johnson as the Civil Rights Act of '64. So another instance of interest convergence. And so I talk about that in my hashtag Living While Black piece. So we have racism as being ordinary and not aberrational as one tenet, interest convergence as another tenet, and then social construction, the social construction thesis, which is simply that race and races are socially constructed and not naturally occurring. And of course, there are things like differences in skin color and hair color and the like, but that is not, or hair, those differences, but those are surface, and other things that are what you would call higher order human variances are the same throughout what we're calling races. So there are intelligent people in all races. There are people with different types of personalities. Those personality traits can be found in all races. So this idea is that the idea is that race itself is socially constructed. It's what we have decided who is racialized in which sort of way, but that this is not something that is naturally occurring. So those are three basic tenets of CRT. This is just a quote from a speech that I made some time ago, actually earlier this year. I was blessed to receive an award from the ABA State and Local Government section, the Jefferson Fordham Award. And in my speech, I said that I believe that it's important to interrogate the role of race and racism in society, and to combat any notion that the law in this country has been objective, neutral, or divorced from social or political considerations and isms, including racism, sexism, and classism. Again, this is my the way in which I go about looking at my work and trying to figure out what's happening in society and what sorts of remedies we can come up with to make our society better. So I'll tell you a little bit about one of the recent pieces and the ways in which I have incorporated these CRT ideas. And again, I'm very interested in legal scholarship that has practical application, that is relevant to what's going on in the world today. So let's just go ahead and I'll go into it from there. So the piece that I believe has been provided to you all, and hopefully you'll get a chance to read it, hashtag Living While Black, Blackness as Nuisance. It came out of this idea that starting in April 2018 at Starbucks in Philadelphia, you have this spate. Every week there was something going on where white folk were calling the cops on Black folk for being in just, regular places doing regular things, what I'd call living while Black. And a lot of people talked about this from a criminal justice standpoint. Well, I am a property scholar, and so I saw it as, oh my goodness, they're using the language of nuisance and trespass about these folks, trying to get them removed from these spaces. And so again, it's this idea that space has racial characteristics. Again, I'm rooted in this idea that race itself is socially constructed, and that there are structures in place that are keeping certain groups subordinated within those structures. What I looked at was the use of of social media, and that's why the name of the article is hashtag Living While Black. That was the hashtag on social media. So all the reason that people were able to, that the lay people knew what was going on is because we had this whole, we had all these videos. Everybody is now a videographer, right? Everyone's a media mogul with their phones in their pockets. So we have the high quality cell phone video and that sort of thing. And you may ask, well, what is Living While Black? And I'm just putting up pictures of Black folk doing regular stuff. But these are some of the situations in which I'm watching the news and seeing that folk are having the police called on them. And so I also looked at the work of another theorist, another CRT theorist, Professor Elise Body, and she coined this term of racial territoriality. And that's just this idea that somehow areas have racial, that space can be characterized by race, that space can be racialized, and that certain people can be excluded from spaces. And to bring this back to this idea of CRT, I had to look at history, right? Remember, we said that one of the things CRT does is look at context and history. And so I looked at historical context, and there happened to be a case in Kansas where you had, after the Civil War, Black folk on the Great Migration moving from the South into the Midwest and the West, moving north and west. And so some ended up in Kansas, and you had a lawyer in Kansas, Mr. Falloon, who was upset because his neighbor, Mr. Schilling, was building houses on his land for Black folk, and it was the land that bordered his land. And so he said, no, this is a nuisance. They should not be here. And the court did not agree. The court said a Negro family is not per se a nuisance as long as that neighbor's family is well behaved. It matters not what the color, race, or habits may be, or how, and the court, this was the court's way of saying, I don't necessarily want them near me, or how offensive personally or socially it may be to plaintiff. Plaintiff has no cause of complaint in this court. So why do I say that this has anything to do with CRT? Well, remember, we say CRT is a lens to help us understand the structures that are currently in place and the behaviors that people are enacting in often in social and legal spheres. Well, we had these folk calling the police in the present day on Black folk for being in spaces where they thought that person ought not be. And they were using the language of trespass and nuisance. This shows us, going back and looking at the historical record, shows us that this is not new. This is not a new tactic. But it also shows us that the law had rejected it before. And here, the hope is that we can keep the law continuing to reject those sorts of ideas. Let's see if I can go forward. Sorry, my slides seem to be stuck. There we go. Again, this was important because of this use of, like I said, everyone was a videographer. And I mentioned to you all that this all started with the Starbucks incident. And there were other incidents, right? We had, and you may remember these ladies, they ended up with names in social media. But again, one of the things we wanted to look at, well, what are the structures in place that made these incidents possible? Some of them are the ways in which police and 911 dispatchers are trained, right? And so part of our response is, well, what's the better way? Is there a better way to train them? Certain questions that should be asked so that you can get to the heart of the matter and don't have the police coming out to possibly confront and escalate when we have a situation that is actually just an everyday situation and someone being irritated because they're having to share space with a person from another background or racial minority that makes them uncomfortable. And the reason that this is important from a legal standpoint is not just what I've already mentioned, but this then is another mechanism by which people of color, Black people especially, could end up with more contacts with the police. And so one of the things that we've learned through empirical studies is that the more contact you have, of course, with the police, the more likely it is that it's possible for escalation going everywhere from arrest to death, which is what and so all this then ties in. We go from April of 2018 all the way to the murder of George Floyd in 2020 and the racial reckoning that came from that. And I'm going to skip some of these because I'd like to get to your questions. Again, been blessed to have some of this information disseminated in other ways that might be more accessible to people. One of them was in a New York Times article that mentions the piece, #LivingWhileBlack, and it mentions it in the context of the dog walker who called the police on the bird watcher, the Black bird watcher in Central Park. But again, it deals with this idea of what are the structures that are in place that made her think that the park was her territory, and that she should call the police and say, there's a Black guy here that is bothering me. Not just that there's a guy bothering me or whatever it was, even though he was not bothering her, but she used those terms in order to threaten him, to intimidate him, but also knowing that she would have it was possible that she would have the force of law behind her. And again, this happened on the same day that Mr. Floyd was murdered, and so all of these things tie in, and it's just like to go back to our first point, or my first point. These are ways in which we look at the structures. We try to figure out why we have not made the progress that the civil rights movement, that we thought was the promise of the civil rights movement, because there must be more to it, right? If we've had these things put in place, we've taken the pill, right? The pill has been put into the water, but everything still seems to be the same, then it must be something more than changing the names of things, than tearing down just Jim Crow. There must be more to it. And that's what our CRT scholars were looking for. That's what the newer crop of scholars are looking for. And that's part of what my work is. One of the things, and I've just put this up here, is one of the remedies that's out there. There are laws being put in place. This Karen Act in San Francisco, for instance, there's some other acts, but the question still remains, will this be enough, or are there full-on structures that need to be dismantled or reimagined, more than just abolishing certain, or at least trying to punish certain behaviors. So that was a little bit of what CRT is, one of the ways in which I've used it, but I'm happy to answer questions to get a little more deeply into what you all would like to know. So I'm going to stop my share now. And Brooke, I'll let you be in charge of, or whomever else is going to be in charge of the question queue.
Yep, hold on, she's going.
I think they want you all to put questions in the chat.
Yep, so some are writing questions in the chat. Brooke is asking for questions from the field.
Okay.
One, I just wanted to say for myself, I hadn't quite put this together. And I'm an American Studies graduate. English in my undergraduate degrees, and both my master's, my PhD are in American Studies. And one, I can remember saying at boldly, brassly, my parents went around, they didn't hear me, but they maybe wouldn't have appreciated it. But when, you know, you're at graduation parties for college, and I said I majored in, I said I had an undergraduate degree in cocktail party conversation because I majored in English and I needed to know a little bit about everything in order to do it well. And then I said, when I got my American Studies master's, it was like, now I have a graduate degree in it and then got a PhD in it. But what is interesting is American Studies, and this, you know, it's all what we realized as we were going along in it. Now, I graduated in '68, did my master's, waited till I was, I think 35 or so to start my master's. So it was then in the 80s. But that American Studies started after World War II. And it was this surge to understand America and see it then internationally. And so American Studies, also American art just really took off. Art history took off. And so over time, then you get CRT coming to better understand the civil rights era that didn't work as well as people thought. I mean, it's just interesting to see different fields that are new. So American Studies didn't exist in the 1930s. It didn't exist until the 1950s. And its impetus was World War II. And that then you have an impetus here for a new field emerge. So, you know, so is there, you know, and so just think about your own experiences, one in that as you kind of think of questions, maybe more specifically about what CRT is. So it's really this analysis of culture through the lens of, I can say that of race and law. So those are some thoughts that that occurred to me. So questions here from the audience that you'd like to ask or.
Hello. Ooh, excuse me.
Yes, yep, it's on.
Yeah, I would definitely like to comment on critical race theory because it's being painted in a positive light. And being a Black man, strong Black man who grew up not too far from here, I've done a lot of.
I just lost him.
Mics the hand mics do go in and out.
Hello, hello. Yeah.
Yep, it's working.
Yeah, so I graduated from West Shore Community College in this district, and I've experienced racism all my life. I grew up in Lake County, half hour from here, the poorest district, poorest county in Michigan. And thankfully, the ethnicity or the color is equally mixed. So we grew up without by the racism the way other counties or places were, where it was one majority dominant race or whatever. But a lot of my best friends were all my life. The stereotypes and the judgment and the positive, the negative. But you look at CRT, you look at the powers that be. It's people, power, and structures in place that want to perpetuate different divisions. And racism has always been one that they could use to divide us. And division is all about what the enemy uses to conquer God's children. You know what I'm saying? So CRT teaches racism and pushes racism and perpetuates racism. And it teaches people that if you are one race, you're gonna be treated this way and you are oppressed and this is why. And it teaches that if you another race, you are the oppressors, and you should feel guilty for what you've done. It just keeps perpetuating the division that comes with racism. I've experienced it firsthand. I've been thankfully been able to keep it from consuming me. I love all races, but it's a lot of evil people in positions of power that seek to keep us divided. And CRT is one of the ways they do it. And they trying to paint it in a positive light with these presentations.
Let me bring our speaker in here, because Jamila, the gentleman is saying that CRT actually stirs racism, creates racism. How do you answer that as a person this is your field?
I disagree. It does not stir up racism any more than a historical study stirs up racism. What we're talking about, first of all, is explaining what has happened, right? So if I want to know, well, why do segregation, the patterns of housing segregation still exist, right? We have done away with de jure residential segregation. In other words, there was a time when this was the law, right? That certain people could not live in certain places. That is no longer the law. Yet we still have these patterns of segregation. We are a very segregated society. And so something like CRT looks to try to explain that. Well, why is this happening? Are there legal structures that are keeping this that are causing this to continue? So I would disagree with the gentleman. This is not a perpetuation. I can't even say the word perpetuation. I need water. I asked my kids to send me some from downstairs and no one would send it to me. This is not a perpetuation of racism. This is an explanation of subordination. So where there are systems that don't seem to be working fairly for everyone, we seek to explain those systems. I'm still talking, sir. But to say that that someone explaining a system is the person that's is therefore caused the system by talking about it is problematic. Now, one of the things I'll leave it at that. So thank you.
Is there another comment or question?
Oh, can I refute? Can I rebut? Can I come back?
Just a bit, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah. So like I say, I've been experiencing. I'm down here. This is a 90% white district. I lived in this county for 10 years of my life. I know what it's like to experience racism. I know what it's like to overcome it and not let it consume you. I have people that genuinely see my heart and my spirit and not my color. Like Martin Luther King said, dream of a day where people are judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. This CRT is perpetuating the divisions. It's keeping it relevant, the divisions, and it's trying to explain them away in a positive light. And she asks if there are structures in place that keep it going or neglect one race or the other. Those are the powers that be, who the lawmakers and the influencers, the bankers and the lobbyists who influence what this stuff is. They trying to paint it in a positive light to keep it going. It's against the people. How you looking through the lens of racism from the top? How can these people know what it's like down here from our perspective? I'm telling you my perspective and you tell me it's wrong. You know what I'm saying? But I'm out here, I'm the only Black person in here. And it's not about racism to me. I'm trying to come in here and defend the fact that this is a negative, this is not good. You got Don Lemon books in here and stuff, and they Black Lives Matter books, and all this stuff does is perpetuate the division. You know what I'm saying? So I can't even get the words out that I want to say because it's just amazing to me, and my son's sitting here making causing me a distraction. But this is not a good thing. You know what I'm saying? So just another perspective for y'all to think about in the crowd while she giving her perspective, and we should have an alternate perspective as well. And it's good that I'm Black, because that racism card can't be used. If anybody else was up here trying to say what I'm saying, they could say, you don't understand. You not Black. Well, I am. And I understand that it's people in power that seek to keep this stuff going. CRT, this is trying to be painted in a positive light to make people not know what to think. You know what I'm saying? But it's a reason why people is protesting against it all across the country, because it's radical, and these radical curriculums have been being pushed on our students, and we haven't known it, but now we do, and we not for it. And I'm glad that I made it here. Almost hit a deer bringing my son out in 20-degree weather to make it here, but I'm glad I'm here to stand up for against this CRT.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Sir, you had a question? No? Okay, we are going on. Thank you. So, other questions? Yes, there one over here, and then we'll go over there.
Hold on just a sec. We can't hear you. Pamela, I'm sorry, but that mic is not on.
Turned over by a white man. I get to choose my family. You know what I'm saying? It's crazy the type of persecution you face. But you know, I stand strong.
I want to thank you for sharing your views. I can only imagine it must be very difficult in an audience of all white people except for yourself and your son. So thank you. And I can only imagine that being a victim of racism is a horrible experience. And I'm wondering, because you've given this a lot of thought, what would be a better way to combat racism?
I'm sorry, was that a question for me or for the?
Well, the thing is, racism is we're not born racist, it's taught. You know, we used to play against different school systems. I grew up Lake County Baldwin Panthers. We'll play against a district where racism is heavy. The players calling you racial slurs, the coaches is cheating you, the crowd is disrespectful and derogatory towards you. But you go to another district and it might be, you know what I'm saying, mixed. And you don't, it's all love, you know, it's all good. It's all good. So you can see that certain counties and districts, racism is heavily taught, you know what I'm saying? But my wife is white, you know what I'm saying? And she is a beautiful spirit. It's not about her color, it's about her spirit, you know what I'm saying? And I love positive spirits. I could tell when I'm dealing with an evil spirit, it don't matter what color they is. It's evil Black people, evil white people, evil every color. There's evil people in power that's Black, that's white, that's Mexican. They want to keep us oppressed and divided against each other. The cure for it is truth and love and Jesus Christ.
It is. Yes, in the back, and the microphone is coming to you.
Hello. Oh. I don't know if you've seen the movie Glory.
Actually, interestingly enough, it was the first date that I went on with my now husband.
So I'll just say, you know, racism has gone back quite a few years, right? And
Sure.
I have studied the Civil War. But one line out of that movie kind of hit me. And Morgan Freeman was talking to Denzel Washington, and he said, dying is what these white boys have been doing going on 3 years now. Dying by the thousands, dying for you, fool. I know because I dug the graves. So I guess my question to you is, if all these people died, 750,000 in our country, isn't that enough? Should racing finally be gone? Not by now. We paid the price a long time ago, and it just continues. It's hard, isn't it? Hard, tough question. So I don't know what
Yeah.
to tell you. I like what you're doing and what you're saying in that. I can
Yeah.
agree with a few things, but
I'll tell you something, sir. So my parents are 75, and my father was a college student during the civil rights movement, and he was involved like lots of other students in the South. My family is from Louisiana, and we were recently talking, and he told me, he said, I really thought that, and my friends and I, everyone in my generation, we really thought that by the time our grandchildren were born, that this would all be gone. That we really would have this anti-racist, colorblind society. And he said, it's disappointing because we've of course made progress. Of course we have. My dad grew up in segregated schools in the South and sitting on the back of the bus. So of course that's progress. But we thought that there would be more progress. And so one of the things that CRT seeks to do is to explain, well, why haven't we made more progress, and what can we do to get to the promise of America? That's really, really what things are about.
and I'm not trying to be tell you what to do, but and I think you do it, give both sides of the story, especially what I just read here, because white people actually tried to help Black people out of slavery.
And
I'm
yeah, there's,
that
and again,
like that.
yeah, that's not what CRT is trying to do. That's part of why I showed you those pictures of some of the grandfathers and grandmothers of CRT, is that this is not a project of Black folk against white folk or people of color against white folk. This is a multiracial project, and some of the grandparents of this movement are from all sorts of backgrounds, including white people. So this isn't a question of us against them or you against me or anything like that. It's a question of, well, what do we need to do to make sure that America is able to fulfill its promise to all of us? So one of the things is, when you ask the question, even when I know this is one of the questions that you as a community are thinking about, is, well, will our children be harmed in some way? I know that was one of the questions in the flyer that was out there. And the educators will talk to you about what's actually happening in the schools on the ground, because that's not something that I would know about what's happening in your particular schools or in K-12 schools outside of my own kids' schools. But when we say, is this harming our children, we also have to think about, well, who are our children? It's not just one type of child. Even if there's just one child of color in the whole district, that's also, he or she is also our child, right? They're all ours. And so we are all in this together. And that's really part of what the project is about, is making sure that everyone is able to advance together.
Should be on now.
My husband and I are children of the 60s, and we're, certainly following that. And by choice, we lived in a African-American neighborhood in Detroit for 30 years. And I can say our neighbors were as wonderful in Detroit as they are in Ludington. So we've lived as minorities. We also experienced the blockbusting. We experienced the redlining. We experienced the racial steering. And so what I hope that critical race theory can explore is how much money people make off of continuing to stir up racial animosity. I think it continues because some people financially profit from it.
Good.
First off, I want to say thank you for speaking with us today.
Excuse me, could I just ask you while you're speaking is
Yep.
to take your mask down just so
Yeah.
that addiction is better
Sure thing.
for
Sorry
most
about
of
that.
us. Thank you.
So first off, I want to just say thank you for speaking with us. Given the second tenet of interest convergence,
Oops. Just-
Oh, lost you.
Is it working?
all right. Given the tenet of interest convergence, is there a way that we can get the majority on board? As you can tell, we live in a very divided community. And, you know, obviously with democracy being a relatively core American value, we're not going to do much unless the majority is on board. So I guess my question is, how do we get the majority on board? Are there certain tactics that work better as activists? Or do you have any suggestions there?
Yeah. So that's complicated. And I appreciate your asking that question because it helps me to remember to say this in response to that. One of the things in response to the earlier gentleman, it's always important to remember what we mean by minority, right? The African-American population is 13% of the US population, give or take. And so any advance that's made on our behalf has to be in coalition with the majority. There just aren't enough of Black folk in particular to get there by ourselves. So you're asking, well, so with regard to interest convergence, when and where do the interests converge, right? And how do you get people who are in the majority to move forward? I think one of the ways is like what I just said about the children, right? When we say our children, what does that mean? This is very much a democratic enterprise, one in which, and I say that with a big, or the little d, I'm sorry, little d democratic enterprise. So this isn't not about party, but about little d Democratic and little r Republican, meaning that one in which we are interested in the advancement of the republic, in the advancement of the country. And we know that we cannot do that unless all of our people are able to flourish, and that all of our people are our people. So again, this is a multiracial enterprise. Now, how do you get folk to understand and believe that to advance one group does not mean that something is being taken from another group? That's part of the education that has to happen. That for me to thrive doesn't mean that we can't both thrive. It doesn't mean that something has to be taken from you. This is not a zero-sum enterprise. It's not a zero-sum game. And so how do we make sure that that message is being heard all over? That's the difficulty. Part of our problem, and I'll tell you right now, just like these the cell phone images that we were able to proliferate, part of our problem is that everybody has the mic now. Everybody has a soapbox, and it's very difficult for that reason for people to figure out what's noise and what's truth. There are some projects out there where people are trying to help folks sort through information so that they can know what's true and what's not true. But I think part of our biggest problem is that that people are not given good information at this point. And so it's difficult to then rally them behind what's best for the entire populace, and what instead they're being taught to fear rather than to come together.
Yes, there's a question over here. Nathan, you can please stand up so that Nathan can get the mic to you. Yeah, thanks. And thanks for masking and unmasking. And if you would, sir, unmask. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Lucas. I want to also thank you for coming here and speaking today. I have a question based on one thing that struck me was the statistic that CRT has been around since the 1970s. I had no idea. I thought it was like a brand new thing because of all the media coverage on it. And so I guess I wonder, why is there such an explosive reaction now? Like, why in the past 2 years?
Jamila, do you want me?
I'm going to get, well, okay. So in
Go
our rehearsal today, just, checking making sure that our technology worked. Brooke and I talked about whether that was going to be my piece, or if she wanted to deal with that in a separate session. But so I'll give you a very short answer on that. There are scholars who have documented what we'll call backlash. So where there are periods of racial advancement, then there are oftentimes periods of reactive entrenchment or re-entrenchment. We can go back as far as the Civil War and then the redemption. Jim Crow was an answer to Black progress. So we can see those things being adopted societally, being adopted in law, in practice. And so why is this happening now? The large proliferation of information about CRT in the mainstream can be traced back to the murder of George Floyd and the moment of racial reckoning that happened thereafter. That's when you started hearing about CRT in the mainstream. So yes, even though CRT is 40, 50 years old, going on 50, it was not something that was talked about outside of legal circles until this present moment. And there are people, and it's not me making it up, that have said as much on Twitter, like Christopher Rufo, who said this is his life's work for right now, is to besmirch the name of CRT, to put everything that might be racially uncomfortable, to call it CRT, even if it's not. And it also, so that's the shorter version of it. And I think that you all will be getting into it more so in your later sessions, if I'm correct. But Brooke, if you want to speak to that.
That is right. And where we piggyback here is sort of, as Jamila has taken, sort of to give you the historical, go ahead. You want a question? Okay. Track. And the very condensed, but what blew it up is, as Jamila is referring to, is a man named Christopher Rufo, who is an extreme advocate. And you can read him on Twitter on, I think it's March 15 or 17. I have it'll be distributed next time, and we'll put it online in between. But his aim to appropriate the term CRT to anything that was happening in the schools that was thought to be wildly insane, discredited. And you can see how powerful he is. He's a marketer and advancer, trying to get people to line up and vote in his way. So that's one of the strongest origins for how it just hit the road and blew up, and CRT got named for it, but it wasn't CRT. So there's no CRT taught in K-12 schools. It's just not, it doesn't exist there. So and we'll go into that a little bit more about how that happens, and you'll hear then teachers' points of view of how they've been teaching long before this. The teachers that we will have been teaching for 20 years and more. And how have they seen different curriculums come and go. So that's the question about 1619, and how is it integrated or not integrated into the curriculum. sort of have other issues about history and how do we cover them and how does revision happen about the story, and what do teachers do about it, and how do they, as I say, how do they work it into their curriculum or don't? You know, and some of it is very practical, folks, as we'll begin to see from teachers next time, is schools don't have money to buy books every 2 years. So the books don't change, and that's where teachers teach from a lot. So there is a question here. Nathan, can we get the mic?
There were also some questions in the chat. I didn't know if we were going to talk.
Oh, are there
about
now?
this.
Thank you.
Oh, there's lots of chatter in the chat.
Like, excuse me, like others have said, thank you for your presentation tonight. If I gave you a couple of examples, can you tell me if I'm understanding CRT correctly as it's taught in law schools? So for instance, several people have mentioned housing, and redlining would be an example. I would consider that structural misbehavior.
Oops.
Oh, lost you.
Yeah, at the bottom, and then if the light turns green on the side of the.
Sorry, redlining and so redlining, keeping minorities out of good areas of good housing, which then leads to a perpetual generational issue of not being able to build wealth through home ownership in good neighborhoods. Or another example would be after World War II, the GI Bill was not available to all minority soldiers. Would those be examples of items that you would be teaching regarding CRT in law schools?
Yes. So looking at those structures as examples of the disparity in wealth, of the lack of certain types of advancement, financial and social. So yes, you're correct.
Are there any further questions? I see more comments as opposed to questions right at the moment on the chat. If somebody, do we have a mic?
I do.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't see you in the back. I saw the
That's
hand
okay.
raised here.
Thank
We'll
you.
take these two more questions and then we're at 8:30, so that'll take us out.
Yes, thank you very much for bringing this information.
Thank you for coming.
Oh,
We're trading mics again.
Oh.
Could you please, as you're giving us this background information, can you please explain or provide further input on how critical race theory is an outgrowth of the European Marxist school of critical theory, and how this is connected to Prague? This is where this training occurred, with Prague and the Czech Republic, which previously was a communist state or province.
So critical race theory does not come from a European context. It comes from an American context. It is not necessarily anti-capitalist, and it's certainly not anti-American. In fact, I think the highest form of love for one's country is an effort to and a commitment to making it better and to making it live up to its promise to all people through its own constitutional efforts and enforcement of that Constitution. So I don't have anything to say about any sort of Marxist connection. Instead, what CRT is an effort to explain why things are the way they are and then how we make them better.
Okay, well, it's described as such on the internet, and it's woven through on, as you're doing.
Where on the internet?
As you're doing research on definitions and connections and further information on this theory. Also, the definition of this theory is described as an academic movement, which you mentioned, which seeks to link racism, race, and power. That's part of the definition.
Yes, power. So power can be
That's
economic.
from the same area that is connected. That's the second sentence of the European Marxist School of Critical Theory, that it's an outgrowth of Marxism. So it's all in the same area of research. So can you please speak to that? I mean, you've gone to the training in Prague, correct? I mean, you listed that.
Ma'am, I've never been to Prague in my life. I've just
Well,
answered your
it's on
question.
your-
I'd like to hear the next question, please, Brooke.
Sure, but it's on your page that
On
your
my page that I've been to
information came-
Prague? I've
You have
never
a
been to
quote.
Prague.
It's a quote. So
Okay,
All
thank
right.
you.
thank you.
And we all have to admit, there can be a variety of ways to analyze power. So there's that piece. There was a question coming up here, sorry.
Oh, wait.
We need to get the microphone here. We need, because we're out of time and we need to have as many voices as we can.
I was born, educated in Detroit, worked most of my professional life in Detroit. Also went through the Detroit riots. It was a pornography bookstore that moved up on the corner that sent us to room.
Yep, just there.
So my last stint of professional life, I worked in the prison and healthcare system. And throughout the years, I had to take sociology and psychology and all that good stuff. But what I realized is learned behavior has not changed. And the attitude comes from the parents. So somewhere along the line, we have to teach the parents to teach the kids, or somewhere we have to interfere with that basic cycle.
I'm sorry, I wasn't able to hear that well. I heard about familial cycles, but I didn't know to what we were referring. I'm sorry. It kept going out.
Go ahead, just repeat, summarize what you're asking, what's,
I
or the
think
comment.
most of the racist characteristics of people are learned behaviors. How do we change that cycle?
Good. Jamila, go ahead. 30 seconds.
Yeah, so that's very far outside of my realm of work. I focus on structures, legal structures, not so much on psychology. But there's a school that's a social psychological school with regard to social dominance, and it says that part of it is embedded in human nature, that we always are looking to sort ourselves into groups. But I believe in our higher nature also. And so I think that the way to unlearn any racism or any racist notions that a person has learned is to educate yourself, or if you're little, for someone to educate you, and to try. I mean, it's an idea of recognizing where you've been taught something that wasn't correct, what you can do to try to correct that. It's a lifelong process, just like everything is a lifelong process, right? And so I think that as people learn more, what's the saying? When you know better, do better. So this is never, none of this is about bashing folk over the head. One of the problems I think with the way that critical race theory has been presented in some of the mainstream media is that folks focus on that word critical, and they think, oh, you are criticizing me. No, critical means to think critically about something. So this is about thinking critically about what's going on, and what's the lay of the land, what's the landscape, how are the landscapes shifting, to go back to our process, and then what do we need to do to make sure that everyone has some equal footing and equal opportunities. So I think that's the way forward. And this, again, isn't about bashing anyone or dividing anyone. It's really about bringing people together by finding ways to make sure that everyone is able to flourish.
In closing, I'm going to borrow words from someone who spoke earlier, Pamela Blair. We are talking about tough stuff, and tough stuff that we've had throughout everybody who's been alive here today. We've faced various forms of dealing with race and being more humane and equal, and to provide things in equity, in stopping inequity and providing it equally. I think of, again, writing, and it wasn't until long out of college, and there was this nice, wonderful word for the writing process, and that was that it was iterative. If I'd only had it a long time ago, I wouldn't have thought, I'm so dumb, I can't get the writing out the way perfect the very first time. I have to rewrite 12 times. That's the iterative process. You have to do it and do it again and do it again and do it again until you get where you want it. And that's what it is about dealing with race, about thinking about it, about understanding what is CRT, is it good, is it not, is it helpful for me to do some thinking about life? I have to say, just before we close, there are some things coming under race and racism, which is dealing with sort of the white despair, and there is an author who's written a book called Dying of Whiteness, and there's death of despair of white people, white men who are committing suicide and dying from drug overdoses and alcoholism at a higher rate than anyone else. And so it's like, you know, that's that. And I also think that there's that interest convergence. We all have an interest to have better healthcare, better lives, happier lives. On that note, that's a really Pollyanna note to kind of try to end on. I want to thank Jamila Jefferson-Jones for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
It's been wonderful. The audience has been wonderful. A final word was, someone said to me when she saw the lineup of what we were going to be doing, and she saw this session, and she's very actively involved in school board issues, et cetera. She said, that's courageous. It's courageous for all of us to be doing this, trying to do it carefully, conscientiously, caringly. Thank you very much. See you next week. Good night.
Good night.